Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the Elastic Live user group brought to you virtually across YouTube. Um, Thank you for joining us once again. I know we had a good holiday off, and I wanted to bring us back strong with actually an event we've been planning. I think for a couple of months now. It's been in the works for some time. But with me today is a principal software engineer and kind of the area responsible because I'm bad with words. The person responsible for the a lot of things that we're doing on the Kibana team, Luke Elmers. Luke, how's it going?
Hey, everybody. Good to be here.
We're going to talk about extending Kibana with some plugins and kind of what that getting started looks like. But before we do that, I want to let everybody know about an event we have coming up in February. February 11th, we have the Elastic Community Conference. And there you're going to be hearing different stories, different user stories from all over the world in multiple languages, people sharing a bunch of different ideas, different techniques. I've actually gotten to look at some of the talks and I am excited about it. But if you're not signed up for it yet, be sure to head over to community-conference.elastic.co. And I'll leave that up for a little bit. While we're getting started, and I'm telling you about all these cool things and how you can connect with us and stuff, give us a hi in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from. Let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to learn more about who's watching and what they're most excited about with this. And let us know how comfortable you are with doing Kibana plugins, because if I'm the least experienced person in the room, that's cool. I'm used to that. If I'm the most experienced person in the room, well, then Luke must have disconnected. So I'm sure we'll figure something out. But while people are doing that, if you have some questions, be sure to ask them. This is always an AMA. If it's a specific question about your particular deployment and how you get this particular thing working, I can promise you we probably will not be able to answer that question. But there is a place where you can get that answered. That is in Discuss. Be sure to ask your questions there, provide all the context that you can, and we'll be happy to get that. If it's a general question about what we're talking about, anything that Luke's showing, feel free to ask that. We'll try to get to it as fast as we can. I'm going to have my own questions because, again, this is kind of new for me as well. And hopefully we'll be able to kick it off shortly. But while Luke is getting set up with his screen and everything, I wanted to ask him a few questions. So Luke, tell everybody about yourself first and foremost. Where you hail from and what you enjoy working on within Elastic and Kibana.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Luke. I'm based in Colorado. Been at Elastic for 3.5 years or so. Been on a handful of different teams at Elastic. Worked briefly on the visualization side, more broadly on what we call the app team now. Worked on a team that was called App Architecture, now App Services, and now I'm working on the Kibana core team. So for me, I am really passionate about building platform services, building tools for other developers to build on top of. So that's part of why I'm here. Yeah, that's my bread and butter. So the core team is responsible for a lot of the underlying infrastructure in Kibana, including the core services that all plugins depend on. As a part of that, we're also responsible for the plugin APIs themselves, and kind of the architecture that comes along with it. So it's a fun problem space to work in, especially as Kibana has grown and we have more and more developers working in Kibana actively. There's a lot of fun stuff going on. So that's a little bit about me.
I love it. And it's one of the things that constantly amazes me about the Elastic Stack as a whole is how much we're using Elastic and using the Elastic Stack. So if I remember correctly, the thing that makes Kibana so extensible is the fact that it's built on that background of like using the Elastic Stack APIs, the Elasticsearch APIs, with a mixture of like our Ruby modules and like our JavaScript modules and things like that. Is that accurate, or am I like
Yeah,
misremembering things?
I mean the fun. We don't really have any Ruby in Kibana, but there's definitely a ton of JavaScript, a lot of TypeScript. Actually, we did some digging into this recently, and currently Kibana is the largest TypeScript monorepo on GitHub, the largest public one that we know about. So it's massive. It's a couple million lines of code that we have. Yeah, the cool thing about Kibana is it started originally just as like this little kind of UI interface on top of Elasticsearch that was really built around the Discover use case. So the Discover app that you've seen in Kibana, that was kind of where it all started. And then eventually dashboards trickled in there and some other concepts got layered on top of it. And now it's really a full-blown platform with all sorts of things that are built in Kibana, but it's all running on Elasticsearch as its data store. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to make that happen for all of our different use cases that we have as Kibana has grown and grown.
Cool. And then maybe the other question there is the this plugin architecture, is it similar or different to like what we're doing with like fleets and like the fleet rollouts and things like that, or are we, talking apples and oranges here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, in general, I'd say so pretty much everything in Kibana is a plugin. So we have the core APIs, and then essentially everything that sits outside of that is a plugin. Anything that you see and interact with is part of a plugin in Kibana. This is an architecture that we moved to over the last few years. It was actually a really long project spanning several years, moving from our legacy code base, the way things were structured, to this plugin based architecture. We had a concept of plugins before, but they were a little bit different. The dependencies were not quite as clear. The ways that you could extend or build on top of other services were not immediately clear, and contracts weren't explicit. So it made it a little bit hard to like dig in and figure out when things were going wrong or you want to change something. It was just harder to track. So the new architecture lends itself a little bit more to explicit contracts between the different plugins. And really what it enables you to do is a plugin can run, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, can run on the Kibana server or on the client in someone's browser or both. And the way that you author these plugins is pretty much the same on the client or the server. So one of the fun things, about a lot of Node projects, but definitely about Kibana, the way we've done our plugin architecture, is the lines between front and back end are pretty blurred. So at any given time, unless you're writing React code or some Node.js specific code, in which case you're pretty obviously in the front end or the back end. At any given time, it's not always easy to tell, like if you're working on the front end or the back end, because it's all very fluid, which is nice. It makes it easy for our team in terms of scaling and so forth for folks to jump in and work on different parts of the stack that they might not traditionally. So the plugins pretty much provide an opportunity for you to plug into both the client and the server and all the different things that are happening in Kibana. And there are a ton of different extension points. There are other plugins that just provide services for plugins to consume that are some of our platform service plugins. And then there are some plugins that are rendering a UI or an application like you see in Kibana. So they can do all sorts of different things. They're pretty powerful, but fundamentally they're pretty basic building blocks that work on this concept of life cycles, which we'll get to that in a little bit here too.
Definitely. Okay, so last question before we jump into this demo. Like, sure. I'm always a fan of like, what's the use case? Like, give me a cool story. Like, what's the coolest plugin you've seen developed from the community?
Oh man, that's a great question. And I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint just one, but I think that for me, some of the ones that I think are really cool are, there's been a lot of activity in the area of visualizations historically. That's probably the biggest area where we see third-party plugins being developed. And that's fun to watch because, just like anything else, when we're building in Kibana, we have to make really tough choices over what things we're going to prioritize at any given time. And visualizations is one of those. It's sort of like this endless pool of like, you could build new types of visualizations forever. And we have to figure out which ones we're going to focus on. And so I think a lot of the visualization specific plugins that we've seen from the community are pretty exciting to see, because they're usually filling a very specific need that we just aren't able at the time to fill. And then it's also helpful for us because it helps us to see what sorts of functionality folks want from Kibana outside of GitHub issues and enhancement requests and so forth. If someone's actually taking the time and the dedication to build their own plugin for the community, that's a pretty big investment, and that's also clearly a sign that there are folks in the community that could really benefit from it. So for us, it's helpful to see that as well and really understand, oh, there's a need for this, and maybe we can figure out a way to incorporate something like this into Kibana Core itself.
And I want to throw out there too, if you're building plugins and you're like share them with the community. One of the things that we do is we have a contributor program that, like, when you go and do this stuff and you let us know about it, like, you can actually get different benefits and things like that. You can get like certification attempts and all this stuff. And like, I mean, again, you got to go through the whole process of the contributor program and like doing it enough times to earn those things. But I always like to let people know, like, you can contribute with code, and you can contribute code, and you can say, hey, I built this thing, community, like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how this is useful. Let's inspire other people to do these things. And that's something that the community team's pretty passionate about, is making sure that when you make something, you know, my methodology is when I see somebody doing something cool, I want to tell the world. So like, let me see the cool things that you're doing. In fact, if you're working on something now, like, tell us what it is in the chat, and then like I'll make sure I throw it up on the screen to show people, like, hey, you know, so and so's working on this cool thing. But that said, we're going to work on a cool thing because you're going to show me how to get started with Kibana plugins, and I'm going to stop talking now and let you drive.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. And while I'm getting this pulled up too, just on that note, I definitely want to hear, if you're in the community and you're building a plugin, I would love to hear about that personally. And one of the best ways you can let Kibana developers know about that is there's a page on our docs site, which Jay, I think I sent it to you before. Maybe we can throw it up for everybody. This is a list of known community plugins in Kibana that's in our documentation. And we encourage you, if you have a plugin, open up a pull request to the Kibana repo, just adding your plugin to the list, and maybe tell us a little bit about what that plugin does. That's a great way to get visibility for the Kibana team here, so that we can know about the types of awesome things that y'all are building. So please do that.
I should have asked if this was like Hacktoberfest compliant, because I feel like we would have brought you in October and you just had all the different plugins added.
Yeah, we have done Hacktoberfest for the last few years, so next year is another chance for everybody.
That said, get them in today. Don't wait till October.
Yeah,
like, we want to see them today.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, let me see if I can share my screen here, and we can take a little bit of a closer look here.
Yep.
All right. Just a moment. This is where it would have been helpful for me to give permissions on my Mac to share my screen before we started here. All righty. Okay. All right. Well, Chrome is threatening me that I'm going to have to quit to share my screen.
Okay, well, you do that. I think we have a question that I can answer while you're doing that, and I'll also do a quick promo, so you can just hop out, hop back in. We should be good to go.
Sounds good. I'll be right back with y'all.
All right. So we actually did get a question that came in that says, is this about the open source edition of Kibana or only the commercial edition? This is actually about the open source edition. This is our free and open architecture. So whether you're building this architecture, you know, home server, whether you've got some racks in the office, you're doing, you know, Docker, Kubernetes, and you're working on prem, that's what this is going to focus on. Yeah, and I think actually the build that we're going to be looking at is one that is from our beta, our 8.0 beta. So if you want to see, if you see some stuff and it doesn't look like yours, that's probably why we're working on the 8.0 beta, which you can actually be working on too. While we're waiting, I can grab a link for that. But before I do that, I also want to throw out again, if you're in the community and you haven't seen it yet or you haven't heard about it yet, The community conference is about to kick off next month, February 11th. It's going to be a great time, a bunch of talks. The CFP is closed at this point, so we've gotten some talks selected, and I'm looking forward to hearing more and more about them. I've only gotten to look at a handful of them, but I know that a lot of them are going to be awesome. Looks like Luke is back. Let's bring Luke back in. There you go.
Hi again.
I was just answering a question about is this about the open source edition of, or sorry, the free and open edition of Kibana, or is this for the commercial edition? So I guess, yeah, is there a licensing requirement for this?
This is just part of the free and open code. So because everything on Kibana depends on core, this is not in our XPack directory where any of our commercial offerings are. It's under our current Elastic license v2 and SSPL, I believe. So
okay,
yeah,
sweet. All right.
So let me give this another shot here.
Yeah, because if you want me to drive, like that's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah, if you could just whip up a plugin real quick, Jay, we'll
have to walk. I'll have to take that refresher on TypeScript as well, just to make sure everything's good.
All right, let's give this a shot.
There we go. I see some stuff. I'll let it get loading, and if you can hide the StreamYard window so we don't get that infinite tunnel.
Yeah, is this looking good? Are you seeing my chat and stuff, or are you seeing my?
I'm seeing all the things.
All the things. All right.
Hide your email. Hide your keys.
And there we go.
All right.
All right.
If you're ready, I'm ready. We'll throw it back up there.
Great. Hold on 1 second here. It's because I just need to hide the StreamYard window here. Do this one more time.
I think you're already sharing.
Oh, I am still?
Yep, you're still sharing.
Great. Perfect. All right. Let's get cooking then. You got my code editor here?
We do. I will say the text is a little small.
All right. Let's blow it up.
It may be because we've got like 3 windows open at the moment.
We do, yeah. It doesn't help I have a giant monitor here. Let me know if this is getting more legible as we go.
For me it is, but I want to be respectful for chat. So chat, if you can't see, just let us know in the comments. Say, hey, it's a little small, and we'll try to get it figured out.
Yeah. Let's see if this helps. Great. Sounding good. I can't see chat, so you'll have to just let me know.
So far we're looking good.
All right, cool. All right. Well, then in that case, let's talk a little bit here. So feel free to interject at any time. I thought today we could just take a little bit of time to build a little simple Hello World plugin. There are a handful of concepts to wrap our heads around here, so I thought this would just be a good way to start. We'll just add a little bit of functionality to a plugin, show you a little bit about what the basic structure looks like, and we can talk about the different integration points. So okay. With that,
really quick, they're saying just a little bit bigger, maybe.
A little bigger? All right.
Maybe, yeah. Ooh. Okay, I think that's, there we go. That's a lot a bit bigger. I think that should be good.
Okay. All right, we'll give this a shot. Yeah, definitely speak up if I can change anything else here, make it bigger. So, all right, everyone. So what we're looking at here is I just have, I'm running Kibana from source. So I'm not going to walk through the steps to do that. We have a contributor.md markdown file in the root of the Kibana repo if you need information on how to run Kibana locally. But I'm just running it from source now. I'm running a little single node Elasticsearch dev cluster locally on my machine using this ES snapshot command that we have when we're running locally. It just spins up an ephemeral Elasticsearch cluster. And I'm also running a Kibana server here, which I started with yarn start -- run examples. We have these sample plugins, which I'll talk a little bit about. If you include this flag when you're running in dev mode, it'll actually include the sample plugins inside of your Kibana so that you can take a look at them. And they're a really good reference point for all the different things that plugins are capable of doing. So that's pretty much what I'm doing here. We're running from source. I'm using the main branch from probably yesterday. So this is fresh code that will someday make its way into an 8.1 deployment. but for now, we're going to use it for building a plugin. So here in my code editor, I'm just looking at the Kibana repo. Couple things to point out. The plugins directory right here is where you place any additional like plugins that you want to add into your Kibana deployment. So all of our plugins that we have that live in Kibana's core live in source plugins or in Xpack plugins are the two directories where you'll find all of them. So if you're ever curious about the different plugins that make up Kibana, you can take a look in these directories and kind of see and learn about how these plugins are structured. But for plugins you want to add, they go inside of this plugins directory, which is not tracked in version control or anything. This is all get ignored. The other thing that I've done here is I have pulled up this kibana.dev.yaml file. If you've configured a Kibana deployment before, you'll be familiar with the kibana.yaml file that lives in this config directory, which is included in the built version of Kibana 2, and that's how you configure your whole deployment. There is a kibana.dev.yaml you can use. So if you're running a dev server locally and doing work on Kibana, it'll automatically pick up your configuration from your dev file instead of from the kibana.yaml. So I have a really basic configuration here. I'm just running Kibana on port 5901 on my local host. And I added a little bit of configuration around my logging to make it easier to build, to look at the logs for the plugin that we're going to build. So I have, for logging, I've set for my root logger, I'm just logging any errors. But then for the Foo plugin specifically, which is the incredibly creative name I came up with for this plugin, we're logging at the debug level so that we can get all the logs just for this specific plugin over here in our console when we're looking at the Kibana logs. That's my kibana.dev.yaml and the logging configuration. Let's take a look at this Foo plugin that I talked about in the plugins directory here. So you can see I have a directory called Foo. This is where my plugin is going to live. Now I'm going to walk through kind of the basics of the structure of a plugin. But one thing I want to mention is in our docs here, we have some tooling that can help you to generate plugins. And I believe it's here under our developer guide. If you go under developer guide in the Kibana docs, we have, I think it's under external plugin development. We have this link to plugin tooling here, and we have this generator, which makes it really easy to kind of generate the scaffolding for a plugin if you're building a plugin. I already have that here. I have actually a kind of a simplified version of that just to make it easier for us to wade through. But the generator is definitely the place that you want to start if you're building a Kibana plugin from scratch, because it gives you a lot of the boilerplate and kind of sets it up based on the best practices we have for how we tend to structure our code in our plugins. So here in our Foo plugin directory, let's talk a little bit about the pieces that we're looking at. And again, Jay, feel free to interject at any time if you have any questions along the way, or if anyone else does.
I think we're tracking so far.
Great. All right. So far, so good. So we have our Foo plugin directory. I also have this bar plugin that I made, which we'll look at that in a minute as well. The first and main thing I want to point out here is it all starts with this kibana.json file. So this is really the manifest that explains to the core plugin system, like, hey, I am a plugin, and you can treat me as a plugin. And it gives some information to core so that we understand what to do with it. So we go traversing through all the directories, the subdirectories in this plugin folder. And then as soon as we hit one of these Kibana JSON files, we know, oh, we found a plugin. So we can do something with this now. So the manifest file is going to include an ID, which is just going to be the ID for my specific plugin. This is also the ID that is used to reference my plugin from elsewhere in Kibana. So if other plugins want to declare a dependency on my plugin, they'll use this ID foo. The version is the versioning scheme for my plugin, which could be different from Kibana's. So this can be any arbitrary thing. I just set it as 1.0.0 for our purposes. And Kibana version here is saying, hey, what version of Kibana is this plugin compatible with? Now, by default, I just have this saying Kibana, which is sort of ignored. But when you actually go to build your plugin, if you want to install it in a Kibana deployment, we'll ask you what version you're building it for, and we'll replace this for you. But you can also put it in here if you'd rather and control it directly in the manifest. It wants an owner name, so you can just put your name in here and a description. And then down at the bottom here, this is where things start to get interesting. So we have a server and a UI option. These are Booleans, and this is telling the plugin system whether my plugin needs to run on the server, on the client, in the browser, or both. So in this case, we've made a plugin that runs on the server and in the browser. And then the plugin system will know to look for the server and the public directories, which you can see here. We have a server and a public directory. That's where the plugin system is going to look for my code that's running on the server or in the browser. And this is where I was talking a little bit how when you're working in Kibana, the lines between front end and back end kind of blur. And this is kind of the root of where it all starts. It's like the only difference really between what's running on the browser and what's running on the server is whether it's sitting in a public directory or a server directory. Otherwise, anything that lives in there, it's just all TypeScript or JavaScript.
That's an interesting thought, because I mean, granted, for most of my demos, most of my examples, everything tends to work kind of in a limited capacity, because obviously I can't give a conference talk on like, here's 15 terabytes of data, have fun looking at it. But I often think of Kibana as the visual component to Elasticsearch, or like this is the Elastic Stack visualized. I would love to learn more, maybe in a different user group event, about like backend usage of Kibana. I think that's something that is kind of something that doesn't get talked a lot about. So yeah, maybe after this we can figure out who the best person is to learn more about like backend Kibana work.
Yeah, well, I mean that's one of the big things that's changed in the history of Kibana. I mean, Kibana originally was just like a kind of a front end app that just ran with Elasticsearch, and then over time, Kibana had its own server. And now the Kibana server, we do a ton of stuff on the Kibana server. There are a lot of things happening, and so that's really grown and grown and grown over time. So on the core team, for example, we build services both for the client and the server. But I would say on the whole that the majority of the stuff we've been doing now is actually doing backend work on the Kibana server, even more so than we do in the browser. And then of course, there are other teams that are building a lot of the applications that are living in the browser. They're spending a lot more time in the UI code. But yeah, it's a whole other universe of stuff we could talk about, and we will touch on some of it here today. But of course, won't have time to go super deep on all of it. We'll just kind of do a cursory overview. So yeah, we have this server in this public directory. Down here, we also have required and optional plugins. So this is how I mentioned a plugin can declare dependencies on other plugins. This is a mechanism by which we do it. So if we wanted to declare a dependency on a different plugin, we would include the ID of that plugin here. Required plugins are, of course, required. If those plugins aren't present, then your plugin is going to fail to run. Optional plugins, your plugin will run either way, whether or not that other plugin is available, and then you can conditionally handle the logic inside your plugin. All plugins are going to get access to all of the core services for free, which we'll see what that looks like in a minute as well. But it's just if you need to depend on a service provided by another plugin. And we'll take a look at an example of that too here in a minute. I won't go through all the files here because some of these are automatically generated. But just really quickly, there is a package JSON, which should be familiar if you're building anything in the JavaScript ecosystem, NPM. The name for this is going to be the name of your plugin. The version doesn't really matter if you're not publishing this as an NPM module, which most likely you're not. And there are some scripts that we include in here to make it easier for you to build your plugin, just some little helpers. But this would be where if you want to declare dependencies on other libraries, other NPM libraries, you could include those dependencies here in your package JSON for use in your plugin if it's something that's not already available to you in Kibana. There's a tsconfig file if you're working in TypeScript. The main thing to highlight here is just that we have these we use TypeScript project references. So if you are using TypeScript from another plugin, you want to include a reference to that plugin here. So right now I'm doing a reference to the tsconfig files from core, as well as the data and this var plugin, which we're gonna get to here in a moment. I'm including that in my references, but that's just one thing to know. And then there's this build and this target directory, which are also get ignored. If you build your plugin, the output will be here. So you can see earlier I ran a build for 7.16, and then the target is where the compiled code ends up living when it's compiled from TypeScript. So we have a server, a public, and a common directory. Like I said, if anything in server directory is running on the server, and public, it's running on the client. This common directory can be code that is shared between the server and the public directory. So in this case, there are these two consts, the plugin ID and plugin name, that are exported from common. And the important thing here to keep in mind is anything that you put in a common directory that you want to share between the client and the server, you just need to make sure it can obviously run on the client and the server. You can't have browser specific code in here or anything like that. It needs to be something that can safely run in both places. So this will all get a little more real when we look into the directories here. So let's start with server. Any of these directories, when your plugin loads, a plugin system is going to see, oh, I say server true. So this is a plugin that can run on the server. It's going to look in my server directory, and it's going to go into the index, and it's going to look for an exported function called plugin. This is what kicks everything off. The plugin system is going to expect there to be this function that it can call, and it will pass in this initializer context, which is some context that you can use to set up your plugin. It has a few little services and bits of information attached to it that you can work with. So that's really what's required to build a plugin. This is like the main thing. But once you export this, you can then return an instantiated plugin class, which is what defines the functionality of your plugin. So in this case, I made a foo plugin class, which I'm importing from this plugin.ts file. And there's nothing here right now. But the class, the way that plugins are structured, we work on a life cycle concept. So you can kind of see they're mirrored here in the actual plugin class. We have a setup method, a start method, and a stop method. These are the main life cycles that are used by all of Kibana plugins. And really all of Kibana runs through these life cycles, and they're the same on both the client and the server. So the way this works is things that happen inside of the setup life cycle. This is like your initialization logic, your registration logic, setup tasks that need to happen to be available for when your plugin is actually running. And then the start method is where the bulk of your plugin logic usually is happening. So you've done all of your kind of initialization stuff and set up things like on the server, like registering an HTTP route, for example, is something you would do in setup. And then in start is when you can really start consuming other services and rely on everything being available. The reason we do it this way is so that plugins have a guarantee that any initialization and registration logic that needs to happen, they can have a guarantee that they've happened for all plugins before their plugin has been started. So here in my plugin, anything I put here in start, I can be assured that all of the other plugins have done their setup tasks that they need to do before I run anything in my plugin. So say I'm running on the client and I need to call an HTTP route and calling some REST API on the Kibana server, I can know as long as I make that call from my start lifecycle that route should already exist on the server, because that has to happen during the setup lifecycle. Of course, when I'm on the client, maybe not the best example, because when I'm on the client, the server has already run through all of its setup and start, and the server's running, and then the client has a separate set of setup and start life cycles. But you get the gist.
Speaking of trying to figure out, obviously you don't do core start until core setup is kind of done doing its thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any support for like any type of asynchronous processes, or using promises or anything like that?
So right now we actually, so we had for a while a concept of asynchronous life cycles. We've moved away from that because what it meant in practice, right now we have well over 100, probably 115 or so plugins that run from Kibana core, or when you are running Kibana. And what it meant in practice was that any one of those plugins could slow up starting the whole server if it was doing some long task, because everything would stop and wait for that task to complete. So we've actually moved toward these being synchronous. But we do have, folks have different workarounds. If they need to do some sort of task, they can like immediately invoke it, for example, inside of the lifecycle methods. Not something we encourage, but there are ways that folks can do that. However, for the most part, we try to nudge people toward, building their plugins so that the setup and start life cycles can stay synchronous, and don't need to be asynchronous. And then the asynchronous operations can all happen further down in your plugin. Basically, things get deeper into your plugin.
That makes sense, and I think that's kind of an important understanding too of how the system works. And again, I think that goes back to, us, eating our own dog food, us using our own products, and for those reasons, encouraging people to say, hey, let's, can it be done? Well, a lot of things can be done, but probably the best practice is to try to keep things synchronous. And here's a good reason why. And because, the first thing you do is like, oh, asynchronous, it increases performance. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, performance has been decreased. So what is happening? So I think that it's good to be able to look and say, like, this is probably a good reason why we want to keep things synchronous. At the end of the day, it's going to keep things moving and like processing smoothly.
Yeah, and that's another big difference that we think about between the client and the server, which is kind of obvious, but from a performance standpoint, I mean, assuming if you have a single instance Kibana deployment running, there's obviously one server. So especially this is important on the server, because if you are doing anything that might be slowing things down, you're slowing down the entire server, which any number of clients could be connected to at any time. Whereas in the browser, that's just running in somebody's browser. So it's an important distinction for sure to keep in mind.
Cool.
So one other thing I'll point out here on the life cycle, so we have a stop life cycle. This would be any cleanup tasks that you need to perform. Maybe, I don't know, maybe your plugin has some observable it's subscribed to or something like that you want to clean up when it's shut down. When Kibana is attempting to gracefully shut down, it will call these stop life cycle methods for each of the plugins. So cleanup tasks would go in there. The other thing I'll point out here is that each of these methods takes in an argument. The first one is going to be core. So this is the whole core contract, all of the core services that are available in the setup and then in the start life cycles. This is how they come into your plugin and how you can consume them. If you are depending on other plugins as a dependency, that would come as a second argument here. So you would get your list of dependencies and be able to pull them out of there. And the core system, based on what you've declared inside your plugin manifest in your Kibana.json, if you declare any dependencies there, it'll make sure that those dependencies get injected into your lifecycle method so that you can use them. So just to make this a little more concrete with an example, this is the server plugin. So we can just add a logger here just to see what's going on and prove that this is working. So let's do that. So for this, I'm going to use our initializer context, and we will set up a new logger. This GitHub Copilot is wild, by the way, if anyone's using this. That's what's like auto-completing this.
I was going to ask. I was like, huh.
It's magic. Yeah, no, it's pretty nuts. I've noticed it's very good at predicting, especially some of these things that you'll do often, kind of these boilerplate setup things. It's very good at predicting the future. A little scary almost. So I've set up a new logger that I can work with here, which I pull off of that initializer context. So now I can say this logger debug and just say, okay, foo. I can say my plugin is set up. And then similarly, I can say that my plugin is started. Okay. And now if I save this, you'll see over here on the right, my server is automatically restarting, which is just going to take a second. But because of the way I've configured my logging in that kibana.dev.yaml, we should see these debug logs surfacing for the foo plugin once the server reboots here.
And my guess is that's just due to the dev setup that you have for Kibana here. Like if we were building something in production and you're like, let me just change this really quick and hit save. No, it's not going to bring down the entire like Kibana instance.
Yeah, well, you definitely don't. Yeah, you definitely don't want to touch the code if you're running Kibana in production. You want to leave that as is for sure. But yeah, because we're running this locally, we're automatically doing server restarts when these files are changed. And you can see down here that we have that the plugin has been initialized and then foo plugin is set up and started. So you can see our log entries here. This is coming from our plugin. So we know Kibana is aware of it. Now, talked a little bit about dependencies. Let's back up and look at that really quickly. So I have this bar plugin, which on the server has its own plugin.ts, and it from the start method returns something. So this is the way that you share contracts between plugins, is what you return from these lifecycle methods. That's what then becomes exposed to anyone who's depending on your plugin. So in this bar plugin, for example, from the start lifecycle method, we're returning this greeting function that gets called and it just says hello. Now, if I add bar plugin as a dependency to my plugin, I will see in the start lifecycle the bar plugin, and I will be able to access this method because that's what's returned. So when I go back here to foo, the foo plugin I made, I'm not returning anything. So other plugins could declare a dependency on my plugin, but they're not going to be able to actually consume anything because I'm not exposing anything in my contract. But if I go here to my Kibana.json and I say, well, now I want to depend on the bar plugin, and I go into my plugin.ts, I can import. We saw that in the plugin up here, it was exporting an interface for its start contract called bar start. So I should be able to import that here now. Should be able to say import bar start from bar server. And then I can have that as my dependency here. So I can say start dependencies. We'll say bar and bar start. That's what I'm going to depend on here. And then down here for start, we'll say we'll get bar out of start dependencies. And now I should have access to bar such that if I want to log this again, I can call bar greeting, and we should see that in the logs when I restart this. So again, if you want to be sharing contracts from your plugin, you can expose them from setup and from start. And then the dependencies you declare on other plugins, they apply whether you're on the client or the server. However, you're of course only in the server going to get the server contracts for a plugin. The client, you're going to get the client contracts for a plugin. And we can see here that the messages have been logged, hello from bar server. So I'm now consuming the contract from that plugin. That's only sort of interesting. And I want to make sure that we have time to actually look at some stuff in the browser here. So let's move forward. I have Kibana running here locally. And we can log in and take a look. Here in my foo plugin, we have the public plugin as well. There's a little bit more going on here, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But I have an application that I'm rendering that we can take a look at together. And maybe we can pull some stuff from the server and do something a little bit more interactive here. So here on my client-side plugin, I'm registering an application. So I'm in my setup method here, and I'm pulling off of core the application service, and I'm registering a new application. Applications are the things that you see pull up in the navigation here on the left. These are all different applications. So I've registered one that I'm calling foo, and I passed in my plugin name. And this is happening during setup. So we have this async method called mount. So this is happening during setup because it's some registration logic that needs to happen. But this mount function is going to be called anytime someone navigates to my app. So we can see here inside of the navigation, if I scroll down, I have foo is right here. If I click on this, what's happening behind the scenes now is core is mounting my application, calling this mount function and passing in some mount parameters, which include an HTML element.
Can we full screen that that browser window, or at least like maximize it temporarily?
Yeah, is it tiny?
Yeah, It's pretty small.
It's a little better.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think the big part that so people can see where it is in the menu as well, like
Oh yeah, I'm
when you
sorry.
register it as an application.
Yeah, so it pulled up down here. And there are settings you can do that kind of control the ordering and so forth. But by default, it plopped it down here. There's also this Hello World plugin that's included. So when I navigate to my plugin, this is what I get. This mount function is called, and core gives me an HTML element. That means I can really use any rendering framework I want to render my plugin. We use React for everything now in Kibana, and that's what I'm using here in the example, but you could really use anything. You've got an HTML element. So what I've done here is I am doing an asynchronous import of my application. So this is important, performance-wise. If I don't do an async import here, then it's going to load all of the code for my whole application from the beginning with the initial page load of Kibana. Whereas if I asynchronously import it here, it's just going to go and get the code that's needed to run my app when someone actually navigates to it. So it's ensuring we have a kind of a minimum initial page load for Kibana. So I load my application, which I've got the application file here that we'll look at in a second. I'm going to skip this line for a moment. And down here on line 19, I'm just using React DOM to render my component into this HTML element that's been provided. And then from the mount function, I'm returning another function that gets called for cleanup when someone navigates away from my plugin. Or from my application. So in this case, I'm unmounting component when someone navigates away. And that's what this mount function does. Again, we're going to get back to line 18 in a second, but let's look at the application that's set up here with some boilerplate. This is using a bunch of EUI components. EUI is Elastic UI, which is our React component library, which, to be honest, is, I think, the most thorough and detailed React component library I've ever seen. It's pretty wild. We have a whole team working on this that does some phenomenal work. So I encourage you to check out Elastic UI. It's also incredibly well documented. So that's what I'm using here in order to get all of these styles, have an EUI page body and get everything, with the nice little borders and my rounded corners here and all of this. It's already done for me.
Selfless plug as well. I know one of the talks that's going to be at the community conference is how EUI is also accessible, and how one of the things that's done is all of these components are tested for accessibility as well. So, as someone who likes to, throw out Tailwind or build his own, modules and things like that, one of the good benefits of using EUI in the actual Kibana spec is you don't have to test for like secondary accessibility being broken once you start adding these assets.
Yeah, that's accessibility is a huge thing. I mean, and for me both, I'm like, I'll be the first person to say I'm not a CSS expert, nor am I an accessibility expert. And so it gives me a lot of confidence being able to use the UI because I know that the folks who are working on this, like, this is a heavy area of expertise for them. So yeah, definitely from an accessibility standpoint, it's huge, and has really been the driver for Kibana being as accessible as it is today. Of course, there's always more to improve and iterate on that, but EUI has been a big piece of the puzzle for us. So I have a little bit of page boilerplate in here. I have this EUI button, which when we click on it to get some data, I have a click handler set up here. And I thought we could just implement a little route to that returns a timestamp. Right now, it's not doing anything though. So if I click get data, it'll say to do because we need to fill this out. But this is the application that I'm rendering from my plugin. Now, one other thing, line 18, which I said I'd get to, we're providing core to my application, which we're not actually using it yet, but we'll use it here in a few minutes. So in order to get this to my application, there is one thing you have to keep in mind, which is because we're in the setup lifecycle here and we're registering our application, we need to do the registration logic in setup. However, the application itself is never going to run until we're in the start lifecycle method. So we need a way within setup to access our start plugin contracts. So we have this core get start services that helps solve this problem. It's basically a promise that's going to return the start contract for our specific plugin. That way, when I'm registering logic like this inside of setup, and it's going to be run later and it needs to interact with some start services, I have a way to get to those services. So that's basically what's going on with this line here. And if I had any other dependencies from start that I needed to access, that would be they'd be the second thing returned in this array. So that's a little bit about the application client side here. So let's try setting up a route that we can actually call, so we can actually see how this all works end to end. So in my plugin here, the first thing I'm going to want to do is create a route. So in order to make a route, I'm going to create a new instance of the router here, core HTTP create router. And then my router, I'm going to say get, and we'll put a path in here. This is going to look pretty familiar if you've worked with anything like Express.js or Happy. Kibana actually uses Happy under the hood, but we expose our own API, and we will declare a route for this. So I'm going to say internal so that other plugins know not to just go using this. I'll say foo to name it for my plugin, and then we'll just call this time. And so that's kind of the configuration for my route. And then we're going to have to do our route handler, which is going to be this async function that has context, request, and response. So in this case, I'll just return response, okay, body, time. Yeah, we can go with what Google Copilot thinks we should do here, or GitHub Copilot. So here we go, time. We're just making a new timestamp here and we'll return this. So when I save this, this should now be working. I did this in the setup lifecycle method because that's where you're able to add HTTP routes. Now, if I go back over to my client-side application here, I can take core, which we've already passed in as one of the props to this React component. And I should be able to say, to get the time back. So I should be able to say time HTTP get. So this is our client-side HTTP service. I'm going to need to tell it the shape of what I'm expecting to get back. So time is a string. And then we will call our route. So internal foo time. I think that's it. And then we should be able to set the time here for our timestamp. Another thing that we can do is maybe pop up a notification to make it more obvious that something happened. So Core has another service called Notifications, which has this concept of toasts, which toast comes from EUI as well. There's a whole section on toasts that you should be able to find in here. They're these little like pop-up things that show up in the corners like this. So I'm going to say Core Notifications toasts. Add success, so this will be a success message, and just say done. So now if we go back to my application here, I'm going to refresh. If I hit get data, we should see there's our timestamp, and it's going to say done. So this happened successfully. Using an approach like this, using the core HTTP service to call the Kibana server, you can imagine there's a whole lot of stuff I can do. Now, of course, I could, from my application, call other third-party APIs if I wanted to. I could also handle some of that logic inside a route on my server. And there are some services that we expose, like Core's Elasticsearch service for querying Elasticsearch directly, which is just exposed on the server. So this is a fairly common pattern where you might have some routes that are exposed to your client for a plugin that then you'll interact with, and then on the server handle querying Elasticsearch itself. Now, I don't know, Jay, this is probably a good time to check in on timing. We could take a look at what it would be like to kick this up a level and query Elasticsearch, but I also want to be cognizant of making sure we have enough time for wrap up and any questions we want to cover. So what do you think? Should we charge ahead, or should we hit pause here?
So questions have been a little light. My question was, I want to see what the pinging actual Elasticsearch data looks like, because in my mind the idea of being able to refresh data and getting just someone who like, I guess if you were looking at this as like a consultant, someone might say, I want this information every time I go into Kibana, and I don't really want to see any of the other stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, here's a plugin that when you go to this page, the exact information that you want is right there and ready for you. So I'm going to be selfish and say keep going. For those that do have to jump off, It's recorded, so make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. It'll be there. Also, if it's okay with you, Luke, I'm going to try to do a condensed version of this video that's just the demo,
Sure.
and kind of removing me blabbering on like I'm doing right now. So that said, keep going. Folks, if you're enjoying this and you got time, keep listening. If you need to see the faster version, I will do my best to make sure that I can get a faster version out in the next couple of days. That'll be a little bit more succinct and have just the demo in it.
And maybe I can also, this would be a good place to plug back in our docs again, a few pointers I'll give to folks in case there is anybody who needs to drop off here. So we have the list of Kibana plugins, which Jay had linked to earlier. These are the known third-party plugins that we have for Kibana. There's a little information at the bottom here on how to actually install a plugin on your Kibana deployment. We have a tool to help with that once that plugin's been built. But here under developer guide, we also have a bunch of information under external plugin development and also this list of Kibana plugins. This is useful. There's actually a big effort going on right now where we're really working to overhaul our docs, and we're hoping to be able to share more of that soon, but we're working on having a really thorough set of developer documentation for folks who are building stuff on top of Kibana. This list of Kibana plugins lists the different plugins that ship with Kibana, and they're a good place to start. Right now, they just link out to READMEs, but they're a good place to start learning about some of the different plugins that already exist in Kibana that you can leverage in developing your own plugin. So this is a good place to go to learn a little bit more. We also are pretty good, we use TypeScript basically almost everywhere in Kibana at this point. We're usually fairly good about how we annotate that stuff. So the type interfaces and so forth usually have a fair amount of information, certainly for the core services. To help explain how you work with these different things. So we're hoping over time to have more kind of tutorial and guide type of content, but this at least will provide you all with a starting point.
Last little bit before we jump into that, if you have a particular guide that you would like, comments. put it in the comments or put it in our discuss as well. Like again, we want to make sure that we're creating content that you want. So when you tell us what you want, that we're writing that down, we're listening, and then we want to make sure that we're taking that back to engineers or even ourselves and like creating content that solves those burning questions you have.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, let's take a look at the last piece here. I think this will only take a few more minutes, but just to get an idea of looking at some real Elasticsearch data. So I do have on my local Elasticsearch instance here, I installed some sample data, which you can get to from Kibana's home. I'm seeing the mobile layout here because it's so zoomed in, but we have our sample data, and I installed our sample weblog data here. And if I go to Stack Management, I should be able to see for, let's see, Stack Management. Here's my menu. I should be able to see the index patterns, or as we're now calling them, data views. Index patterns have been rebranded to data views. We think it's a little more descriptive about what they actually do. But I can see I have this Kibana sample data logs data view that's already here. So we'll work on querying some data from this. We'll just go back to the foo plugin here. Now, in order to do this, we could query Elasticsearch directly. However, there's actually a service that's exposed from a plugin called the Data plugin that's available in the browser that makes it easy for the specific use case of needing to perform searches against Elasticsearch. And the Data plugin is, this is what's used for most of the places in Kibana that you can think of, a lot of them that are just performing your typical search and query and filter type of operations. So like Discover relies on this heavily. The visualizations infrastructure is all using the Data plugin a few levels deep behind the scenes. So that's what we want to add here. So I'm going to go back up to our manifest file in our Kibana JSON and add the Data plugin as one of my dependencies. I can see in my list of Kibana plugins here, I have a link to a README from the Data plugin. which tells me a little bit about some of the things the data plugin does. Specifically, I want to look at this API called Search Source. This is the high-level search API. There's a low-level equivalent that lets you provide something closer to raw Elasticsearch queries with a little bit less sugar on top. But Search Source is nice and succinct. So for demo purposes, we'll go with that today. So I've added the data plugin. I already have that, by the way, included here in my TS config under my project references. So I can go right into my plugin here now and be able to access it as one of my start dependencies. So I have this interface for the dependencies my plugin needs to run. And I think in Data's case, it's called Data Public Plugin Start. And I'm going to import this Data Public Plugin Start. And this will come from, not from core, but from the plugins directory, data, and from public. So I've now added that as my dependency here. So if I go down under start here, ordinarily I could access the data plugin here. However, in this case, we don't need that because I'm actually going to be using it from inside of my mount function. So I'm going to use this get start services trick again in order to access my dependencies here. So the data plugin should show up under my dependencies. TypeScript doesn't like this because we haven't added the data prop to our actual component yet. So let's do that next. We'll say that this is going to depend on data as well. Data public plugin start. Make sure we import that. Again, get the path sorted out. Okay. Now I've added that as a dependency, so I should be able to access that prop from inside of my component. Great, so now I have that. Let's go ahead and make another little button to do something. We'll say search data, and we'll have a different handler here. Search handler. And let's also actually, while we're doing this, we'll add this to our state so that we can actually view the results of this. We'll call this hits. We'll just stringify what we get back from these hits. So let's add a new hook here for the hits. Set hits. In this case, we're going to have, let's see, it'll be an array of results that we're going to get back. Sorry, I know I'm breezing through this real quick, but we're getting to the fun part here. Cool. Okay, am I missing one? Great. And then we need to add one more click handler. Okay, so now this is where we're going to get into search source. So we're going to do set hits. For now, we'll just set hits to be empty. So I'll go ahead and save this. I'm going to copy this code from search source here from the docs. We'll talk a little bit about what it does. Okay. So go back to my plugin here just to make sure we can see our other button. Search data, nothing so far. Now, we've pulled in search source. This comes off of the data plugin, data search, search source, create. We've created a new search source instance, and now we're going to actually query it. I'm going to remove some things that we don't need to worry about getting into right now. So we'll take off the set parent, we'll take off filter. But this is how you can add filters and queries. You can build those up and set the fields, and then just call fetch, and it'll perform the search for you. But for now, we'll just set our index pattern or data view that we want to use. Now, of course, we need to retrieve this data view. So that's going to require another service that's also available from the data plugin. That's called the data view service. It used to be called index patterns. So we'll do data, data views, find, and we're going to, this is basically going to do a find by ID. So we're going to do Kibana sample data logs to get that sample data that we looked at a moment ago. So now we're fetching that. The first result that should come back from that find is the data view here. And then we can pass that in here into search source. And we can also, to make this a little bit easier, we can say set field size to minimize the number of results we're getting back and just get like 2 items back or something. So now I can do search response hits, and then there's another hits array that's nested in there as it comes back from Elasticsearch. And we should see those results here when we click our button. Cool. So this is coming straight back from Elasticsearch. These are our hits. Again, we're not doing any filtering or anything, but just for demonstration's sake, you can see that we get everything back here, and we can do something with this data if we want to. So I guess one more thing that we can take a look at here, one more thing I can plug is our charts library. So let me add some space here for us to visualize this really quickly. So we have something called Elastic Charts. Elastic Charts is the charting library that serves, that underpins all the visualizations, at least all the core visualizations in Kibana and in Lens. And the charts library is pretty amazing. This has been a really big ongoing effort for the team. And the docs for the charts, actually, you can access a lot of them here from inside of the EUI docs themselves. But the repo is Elastic Charts. And so I'm just going to say, let's see, let's visualize bytes. We can just visualize like the number of bytes that come in at certain times. So we can do this as a nice little time series visualization here. So I'm going to click under time series. It shows me a pre-configured chart. Maybe I want to do it as an area chart, something like this. Well, let's go with bar chart. And I can actually just copy a snippet of the current configuration straight from the docs here that then I can plop in here. So if I paste that, I'm going to need to add a few imports. I'll also remove a few things we don't need to worry about here. We can skip worrying about settings right now. I have to put in an ID, so I'll just call this foo for my foo plugin. We have some formatting here. I'll just remove this to make it a little bit simpler to look through. Okay, let's go with this. All right, so I'm going to need to import chart, bar series, and axis from Elastic Charts. From Elastic Charts. There we go. All right, great. So now if we save this, we won't see any real data pumping into it yet, but we should at least see our chart once we get our hits. And then we will plug in the data. So I'm going to hit search data. So here we go. This just has this 0, 1, 1, 2. This is the data that's getting passed into it. But in my case, we actually need to pass the hits into it. So the hits we get, this is an array here. We're going to have to pull out of the source the bytes and the timestamp. So I can just do hits, map, hit. And we can do, let's see. Oh, here we go. It's even auto-completing it for me. Hit source timestamp, hit source bytes. And it will return an array of those items with our hits. So we should be able to actually see them. And actually, to make this more interesting, we probably want more than 2 items. So let's just say 50. And so now, the moment you've been waiting for, Jay, wanting to see this query Elasticsearch for reals, if we hit search data, we should see this all visualized here, the time series data with the results from each of our bytes. And this actually queried Elasticsearch behind the scenes for us. Again, there's a lot more we could get into. You can get really low level with this and construct the raw Elasticsearch queries, but this kind of gives an idea with some of these higher level abstractions that we provide, how you can fairly quickly and efficiently get to accessing and visualizing data straight from Elasticsearch. So yeah, that's the gist. Anything else, Jay? Anything I'm missing?
No, I think that's everything. To me, the one thing that I love about this is modern technology at its finest. Someone mentioned, using Copilot. Autopilot reads your mind. Yeah, like that's
a little scary.
That's definitely a good feeling. But then the other side of that is being able to not know exactly what you're looking for, run through the docs, find exactly the thing, like, oh, this looks cool, hit copy, and then you've only got to change a couple of pieces, and then from there you're off to the races. I think that's one. Shout out to our team for consistently improving on documentation, on making things accessible, not just from a, you know, like a visual accessibility, but also for a people who may not live in the Elastic Stack day in and day out. Because I mean that
Mhm.
tends to be elasticians. We tend to live it, so it's easy for us sometimes, but it's good that we're also trying to make it easy for the folks out there that also have other things that they have to do.
Yeah.
So I think that that's super cool. One of the things I love about this is uh, you showed it like you click a button and it does this. My guess is that you could do that without the button press. Um,
Hmm.
of course, as we mentioned, if you want things to kind of move fast, consider everything that you're doing. If you have to hit that button and you have it doing 37 different things, that means it's going to start to slow down those processes. So,
Hmm.
being able to say, all right, when I push a button, some stuff pops up, or whenever I want to update the data, because my second thought was like data, like working with data streams and kind of other components of like, hey, I have data rapidly coming in. I want to hit refresh and get like a little update on things. I think
Hmm.
that this is a great idea for that, and it's something that doesn't have to be built into Kibana. It can,
Hmm.
because I mean everybody's situation is going to be different. So I think this is really cool. I want to play with this personally. So thank you for not just sharing the code, but also sharing the links. Do we have a getting started repo available to us on GitHub that we can maybe share, or is that
That's a
something
great
that
question. Yeah, we do not have a dedicated repo. What we do have, and I'll be the first to admit, I mean, we've come a long way on our developer documentation, and like I said, we're cooking up kind of a new iteration of these docs, which is going to make things even easier to work with in terms of discoverability, because there are so many services you can work with. But what we do have, if you can't find what you're looking for inside of our list of plugins here, which some plugins have better readmes than others, right? So if you find places that are lacking, or you just need inspiration, or you have an idea of like a type of thing you want to do, we have this examples directory. This is in the root of the Kibana repo. And these are all example plugins, which I mentioned earlier. I ran Kibana with this yarn start run examples flag, which you can do in dev mode. And what that does is that unlocks this developer examples application that's pulled up here at the top. And it shows all these different plugins that have been added. So for example, there's this really great search examples one. It shows how you work with these search services. I'm going to zoom out a tiny bit just so we can see it here. Um,
maybe full screen it, since it's
oh
kind of
yeah,
the thing, or like
yeah,
maximize it, I guess.
yeah. Let's do that. That'll make it better.
Yeah.
So this search examples plugin lets you play around with, okay, I can specify a data view. I can say like a field that I want to bucket on, like maybe I want to do, I don't know, the machine OS and bytes for numeric field or whatever. And I can say, okay, I want to do this for the last 24 hours. And then I can say, okay, make a request from the high level client. This is what we just used, search source. And we can see the actual search that gets generated and sent to Elasticsearch by the service, which, like in our demo just now, we didn't bother writing a whole query up like this. That was just generated for us. And then
Yeah.
it shows the actual response, the raw response that comes back from Elasticsearch. So what you can do is you can look for this specific search examples plugin. You can look at it here in the Kibana repo in the examples directory, and you can see in their client-side plugin what is being done to actually make these queries. So this is actually a really useful place to start in terms of understanding the most common services that are available. And for the most part, we provide a lot of different examples for some of the key services you might be interested in. So here we can see things like state management. If I have state that I want to store in the URL and synchronize with my app, or maybe store somewhere like session storage or local storage to access later. We have examples for search. We have examples for expressions. Expressions is like what originally is this expression syntax that powered Canvas. It's now powering Kibana's core visualizations too. We have stuff around dashboards. It uses these things called embeddables, and this embeddable service if you want to make something that can be embedded into a dashboard. So a lot of things that you can dig into here. So definitely this I'd say is the closest thing we've got to getting started repo in terms of looking at some of these examples. And then also the plugin generator, which I mentioned before, that's in our docs. If you use the plugin generator, that will help you kind of get this initial boilerplate set up to get over that hurdle. And when you run it, it's going to give you actually a more complete version of a plugin than I even showed today, and kind of get some of the initial best practices in place for you to start building from.
I love it. Well, I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I had a
Cool.
couple of questions. I know we're over time a little bit, but I wanted to
That's
make
fine.
sure I kind of covered some of these ideas. One of the things that I love about this is that this isn't designed to replace like building dashboards or adding things in the visual library or using Kibana Lens. But one of the things that I often have that feeling of is like I'm building a dashboard or I'm trying to create a visualization, and then I go, it would be great if dot dot dot. And that's where I love that Elastic uses Elastic. And the same things that we're presenting and putting up there can easily be modified. I think we actually had a topic suggestion where someone mentioned, there it is, how to integrate a custom plugin into a core plugin. So to change the UI, add components, and interact with a custom backend. I've seen some small things change. I've never seen like massive things change, but to me, the idea that, okay, maybe you don't necessarily have to completely change some type of core plugin, but you could do an embeddable, an embedded, a custom visualization into your dashboard, or you can embed, some custom code that you've included and take those results and put those in a dashboard, put those on a screen. Or you can say, hey, I want to take some core components and put that into my custom page that I'm building with this plugin. The fact that everything is kind of running on the same technology, the same, systems behind, means if we can do it within the Elastic, within Kibana, then ideally you should be able to do it as well to fit your needs.
Yeah, and because of the way that our plugin contracts work, and plugins all having access to these same interfaces, like that sort of thing is totally possible. So in that example of like, oh, I want to build something that hooks into Discover. Well, really the question is, does Discover expose some sort of service or extension point or whatever that you could hook into to do the thing that you want to do? If it does, then there's really no difference between what's possible for a plugin that lives inside of Kibana and a plugin, third-party plugin that's been developed. It's all about what's been built into those contracts. So we would deal internally at Elastic, the team here, we deal with the exact same questions. If we wanted to build something that worked on top of Discover and have it ship with Kibana Core, the first thing we'd be doing is talking to Matthias and the lovely folks who work on the Discover side and saying, hey, how can we update the plugin contract, add an extension so that we can do this thing that we want to do.
The other question that I had, and this will be the last question that I have. If anyone else has questions, okay, never mind. We're gonna hide my question for right now. Any backwards compatibility with older versions? Obviously, we were working on a fresh build. How far back does the plugin architecture work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the one thing that I should have mentioned from the beginning of this is these APIs are still these are APIs we don't consider GA at the moment in Kibana. So obviously you're welcome to use them. We make actually a very large effort to keep them like super stable as we can, but we're not considering them GA. So the way this works is there will sometimes be breaking changes in the plugin APIs from minor to minor. We're pretty good about having all of those documented. We have a section by our release notes called plugin API changes, where we'll talk about any changes we're making. Now, of course, because it's a TypeScript project, that makes some things easier too, because you can just see on the next version of Kibana, if my thing doesn't compile, okay, maybe there's some things that I need to change, and we should have those documented. But in general, when you're building a plugin, you're going to build it targeting a specific version of Kibana. And in order to actually use the plugin, you'll build it. So you'll run this command, yarn build. It's going to build your plugin for you and zip it up. But when you run that build, it's going to ask you what version you're building for. So your plugin would then be pinned to a specific version of Kibana. Now, you should still be able to run that on future versions, assuming there aren't any breaking changes that have happened. But that's generally how it works. Now, in terms of backwards compatibility, and I guess getting into how the plugin APIs have changed over time, we did our cutover to this new plugin architecture, I believe in 7.10. So anything newer than then, any versions newer than then, should have a similar feel in terms of building plugins. Anything before that time, if you're trying to support older versions of Kibana, it's a different story, and things look a lot different than what we looked at today. Do we lose you, Jay? Or is it might be my connection that's gone bad? Looks like Jay might be dropping out here. I see this question in chat around planned release date for 8.0. We don't have one announced yet, but we're getting closer. We're getting closer. We've definitely been doing a lot of work testing on 8.0, making sure everything's going to be ready to go. So more news to follow on that. Anyone who's around in chat have other questions? I'm happy to answer. Can we use a plugin if there are any services down? Meaning like if Elasticsearch is down, for example. I'll assume that's where you're going with that. Yeah, if Elasticsearch is down, there are already checks that are happening on the Kibana server side that are going to share warnings and stuff if it's down. But in general, we do encourage folks to build their plugins to be resilient to if something is unavailable, if an external service is unavailable. Not sure if that's exactly what you're getting at, but any other questions? Nope. Cool. Well, Jay just pinged me and said that his internet went down. So if there aren't any other questions, I can just wrap up here. But if there are, feel free to drop them in the comments. Like Jay said, you can also drop into our Discuss forums if there's anything you want input on, especially if it's something specific to your use case. The Discuss forums is a great place to start. Yeah, looking forward to hearing from all of you there. And again, if you are working on a third-party plugin of your own that is not listed in our docs, please tell us. Open a PR. We would love to hear more about what you're working on. So yeah, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.